We're a second generation firm. We've been around Parramatta and the surrounding area for about 35 years. And the idea behind how we work essentially is we're service providers. We solve problems and not give you more when it comes to delivering actual advice. And yeah, we do work with founders, and we have a small, I guess, family office or investments arm, which we do invest in promising startups from time to time. A bit of background about myself. I used to work in finance with Citibank. I then moved into consulting with BCG, which is where I first started working with startups. They didn't really call it startups back then. The traditional name, which a lot of bigger firms sort of deal with startups and tech firms, is TMT, or Technology, Media, and Telecommunications. So I worked with lots of larger telcos and more traditional media firms. And a few years back, I moved over to Australia, and then I worked in a firm that was a tech boutique that was based out of Fishburners in the city. So, it's a really cool place. It's a co-working space, really similar to here. Was really immersed in the ecosystem. And right now, I'm in Frank Law, and what I do is mostly help tech firms with their day-to-day problems, whether it's setup, structuring, employment disputes, and most importantly for a lot of startups, how exactly do you track investment, how do you prepare for it, how do you deal with it, and eventually how do you scale from there. And in terms of the firms I work with, I work with pretty much right across the spectrum: fintechs, medtechs, manufacturing, right up to climate tech. Right now I'm advising on one of our clients is in the sustainable energy space. They're prepping for a Series A and hoping to raise about 15 million AUD. So this is essentially a bit of an overview of some of the topics that I'm covering. To be honest, there's no way that I can take 30 minutes and explain all of this. All of this deserve probably multiple classes to cover, but essentially what I'm trying to give to you, or what I hope you get out of this talk, is an understanding of at least what you're expected to look for, and what are the things that hopefully you don't do when you're setting up your own startup, business, etc. So on to the first part. Setting up a business or a structure. Congratulations, you have a good idea. It's not a hobby anymore. Potentially you're looking at hiring some staff, getting some traction in, you've got a pilot going. One of the first questions from a legal standpoint that you ask yourself is, what is the right structure for me? And if you Google it, the ABR has a really interesting chatbot essentially that takes you through some options. You can set up as a sole trader, a proprietary company, or a private company, which is your standard PTY Ltd. You could be a partnership, trust, or for some of the very lucky few, a public listed company at the end. So the thing you need to, I guess, keep in mind with structuring is all of it is a trade-off. It's a question of balancing between risks, costs, complexity, and flexibility. So the cheaper the cost, the easier the compliance, the greater the risk, the less the flexibility. You pay a bit more money, you get more flexibility, but your compliance requirements and your costs increase. So a bit of a quick overview. If you're a sole trader, really cheap, really easy to set up. You go on abn.com or ABR or something. It's free to register in ABN, but you essentially have no asset and risk protection. Anything goes wrong, you get sued, it's curtains, everyone goes home. Partnership, to be honest, it's really not relevant to 99.999% of startups. Unless you're an accounting firm or a law firm, you should not get a partnership. End of story. Proprietary company, or your PTY Ltds, this is sort of the bread and butter of what we see. This is what your investors will expect to see, not because they expect you to have some fantastic legal structure, but at least paying the $512 or whatever ASIC charges shows that, hey, you're serious about this and you want to actually do business. So this is an example of this is an example of a typical operating structure. Yourself, your co-founders, you own shares in your own name in the company, you deal with clients. Simple, cost effective, everybody understands it. I suppose the one drawback to it is if your clients sue you, or your staff sue you, your assets are directly at risk because you hold the shares in your name, curtains. But at the same stage, if you're a startup, if you're at incubator level stage, if you're at an angel round, realistically you don't want to be spending tons of money on complex structures. You just want to get in, get some traction, and actually figure out how to run the business. This is, I guess, a bit more of a mature setup. This is what's called a dual company setup or a holding company structure. You hear this term a lot. investors expected, especially the more money you raise. It's, for all intents and purposes, what structure most startups aspire to and what they do want to end up. And this is sort of a basic example of it. It can get much more complex, it can get a bit more simpler, it can include companies in different jurisdictions, but at its core, what this structure does is it separates operational risks, which is day-to-day risks, your staff suing you, suppliers suing you, end users suing you. It separates day-to-day risk here from your revenue, your investors' money, and more importantly, your IP. So this imaginary line that we are drawing here helps to quarantine as much as you can day-to-day risks from the greatest strategic goals of your company. It's not a silver bullet. It's not perfect. If there's fraud, if there's all sorts of stuff, this structure can still be set aside. It is not cheap to set up. You need to make sure from a taxation point of view, you're well prepared and you understand your obligations. And from a legal point of view, you've got to make sure your IP is properly structured and properly licensed and assigned. You've got to make sure your contracts actually reflect this. Otherwise, it's just a fancy exercise in failure and you've just lit a pile of money on fire. But in essence, this is, I suppose, the end goal, and this is sort of the structure that most startups want to get to, at least by seed round, and definitely before Series A. This is sort of a side-by-side, oh, sorry, if you don't.
That structure is in common to have, as well as the operating entity, an IP holding company, so you actually have 5 structures, including 2 trusts and 3 companies.
Yeah, it is common. So for instance, if you do have an IP holding company, it'll sit on this level. It'll just be another corporate vehicle, sorry, here. So it'll just be a subsidiary of the holding entity. You can have it as a separate entity, or you can assign it all in the holding company. It depends. Sometimes investors want to see a different one. Sometimes they like the security of knowing that their money and the IP are in the same place, so you can't just cut and run, so to speak. But essentially, this is a side-by-side comparison of how they look. You can see this structure still exists. It's just quarantined from where you would hold shares and potentially where your investors would put in money. Some key points to sort of note. The first thing you need to understand is your structure matters from an investment attraction point of view. Your investor wants to understand, at least if you don't have it set up, that you've thought about it, you have a plan for it, and you've turned your mind to what the end goal is. Is the end goal an IPO? Is the end goal selling to a competitor? Say if you're an interesting graphic design startup in the space, you might understand that, look, probably you're not going to end up as a public listed company, but you might be in an interesting niche that, hey, 10 years down the line, Canva might take a look and say, we need that. And you're a lot cheaper than Adobe in that situation. So you want to set up a structure that makes sense, not just for the short term, but to plan for the long term as well. And risk mitigation is a good way to manage it. And this is a theme that I'm going to touch on throughout, I guess, the exercise and throughout this talk. Get advice early. Setup is cheap. Failure is very expensive. On to the second thing. Whenever I talk with startups, they're always very aware of technical risks, product market fit. Can I raise? What exactly am I doing? Is what I'm building technically feasible? Most of the times, they never consider people. And they never consider that in a substantial majority of I guess, occasions, the reason why a startup fails is, 1, co-founders have a disagreement, and that happens. Your key staff members leave, and you can't continue to scale, or you just can't attract the type of staff and the type of people that you need to really scale your organization. And in Australia, we do have a pretty complex employment framework, and that means that you need to be really across it. You need to understand what are your obligations, what do you need to know to actually onboard staff. Because once you start onboarding staff, it's not just you and potentially a couple of friends as co-founders. You have what's effectively general members of the public that are working for you and you are hopefully paying for. So investing in having good staffing practices is really important. It's important to also understand your agreements and your policies. You can't just put a number down and leave it at that. Sometimes particular staff might come under particular employment awards. You've got to make sure that they match up so you don't, your startup isn't at risk for an unfair dismissal claim or a back pay claim or stuff like that down the track. The majority of litigation and lawsuits that startups face are primarily co-founder or people-based. So this is definitely something you want to make sure that you're across of. You also need to make sure that your employees, your staff, whoever that works on your product, clearly understand where the IP sits, and they assign the IP back to you as, or to be more precise, back to the company. And there are various ways that you can retain staff. There's a bit of a arms race going now when it comes to retaining key staff, your programmers, developers, etc. One way you could do that is, pay them more money, but if you're an early stage startup, you're never going to be able to compete with whatever compensation package that Canva or Atlassian put together. You want to figure out different ways of retaining them: bonuses, earnouts, ESOPs, virtual equity, stuff like that.
Sorry, can you tell me what ESOP stands for?
Yeah, ESOPs stand for Employment Share Option Plans.
Okay.
Another word is ESS, Employment Share Schemes. Some of key questions that I come across, I guess, pretty frequently. How exactly do you hire and fire with confidence? So you want to bring on staff, but you can't spend your entire time paralyzed knowing that, hey, if I bring person X on, if it doesn't work out, am I going to be stuck carrying this person right through my Series A, B, C, and D, and eventually end up in an IPO? So you really have to understand how to keep your staff, how to hire them properly, and then, if needed, how to move them on. You need to figure out another key question we get: what's the difference between a contractor and an employee? That's unfortunately something that startups get wrong quite often, and you end up having to pay employee entitlements like annual leave, long service leave, all that kind of stuff. How to retain IP. This is, again, key point. You've got to make sure your employment contracts are fit for purpose and they properly assign IP back from the employee to the company. Same goes with confidential information. And this point, I suppose, is more general. It's not really so much of a legal question. How do I retain staff? Partly it could be cash, partly it could be a good understanding of how to set your KPIs, partly it could just be the simple rule of, don't be bad to your staff, treat them well. The better you treat your staff, the more keen they'll be to make your vision come real, whatever that is. And restraints. So in Australia, restraints don't quite work like in the US. For instance, it's quite common to have really broad anti-compete and non-solicit clauses if you're based in the US. In Australia, you can't quite do that. You can restrict your staff from potentially leaving and taking confidential information, but you're more restricted in essentially what you can do. And you've got to be careful that what you put on a contract is actually enforceable. So again, some key points: how you identify, how you hire, and how you keep key people in your organization is often the most important thing when it comes to growing from an early stage startup to a serious competitor and potentially someone that's on the same page as a unicorn or Atlassian, Canva, etc. It is critical to understand your employment obligations. This again comes back to risk. The more you understand about your business, including your staffing situation, the less likely you're going to face a Fair Work or general protections claim or lawsuit down the road. So setting up an effective staffing framework, this isn't a purely legal matter. Having whoever's your chief of staff, HR manager, etc., really clued in, it's really important. And reoccurring theme: get advice early, get it set up properly, hopefully you won't fail. And on to a next point that comes up quite frequently: what do you look for in a contract? What do you look for in a commercial negotiation? And when exactly do you walk away? A lot of times, especially for young lawyers, they don't fully appreciate that it's not about designing the perfect contract. It's not about making sure your client bears no risk. That's not how the real world works. In the real world, there's a give and take. There's an understanding that there is risk, there is liability. How are you across that, and how exactly do you deal with it? You have to understand your bargaining position, what leverage you have. If you're dealing with a friend who is an early stage co-founder, you might need each other. Your products might be complementary. You've got more leverage there. When you're dealing with Atlassian, you have no leverage. Be happy that you're considered. And essentially understand where you are, how important you are to the other party, and how much leverage you have in negotiations. Understand who does what, who does when, and who gets paid. That's really, really important. We have a very, very busy litigation team that exists primarily in people not understanding contracts. So that's the most important thing when it comes to contracting in general. Understand what it is you're signing. And I guess for startups, you got to understand what IP and what data is actually being exchanged. record it properly, make sure it's treated accordingly, and in the event that something goes wrong, you want to understand what your exposure is and how you limit it. Rights and procedure and termination. Stuff happens, things go wrong, even with the best of intentions. Figure out how to get out early with minimal damage. Again, some common questions. How do I manage risks? The first principle in managing risks is understanding what you do and understanding what the goalposts are. This is where I'm starting, this is where I'm ending, this is how I want it to go. If you understand that, you're halfway there to really helping to manage your risks. When should you walk away? Don't be afraid to walk away if fundamentally the bargain doesn't work for you. A lot of times startups get stuck in thinking, I need to close this deal because some traction or some users is better than none. That might be true, but if you're locking yourself into a really bad future bargaining position or business position, everything is moot because you might not have flexibility to do anything. How do I determine which party is responsible? This comes back again to who, what, why, when. Who does what? Why is this person doing what? When are the timelines to actually deliver the various things? And when? When are the deadlines? When are the notice periods? How do I get out of this? How to retain IP and I guess your confidential information, really important. Some of it is covered under the contract. Some of it is just good practice. As a general rule, record everything you can, understand what's going where, and hopefully your contract or the IP assignment clauses in your contract are good enough that you can get out of it with your IP intact. Another thing is to sort of turn your mind to what happens when something goes wrong. This is very, very important to you as a startup founder or employee or co-founder, because fundamentally you want to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Understand that things do go wrong, even in the best of occasions and circumstances, and you want to be prepared to understand what you need to do to get out of it, what's your damage, how do I limit it. Again, quick recap on some best practices. Understand what exactly it is you want to get out of this contracting or commercial agreement. Understand the difference between a must-have and a nice-to-have. I'll give you an example. Maybe you might get paid $50,000, yes, but if you concede on that $50K difference, you might get your payment terms reduced from 90 days to 15 days. So $50K less, not great, but if you're getting paid regularly every fortnight, 15 days, whatever, that might be more advantageous for your startup in the long term. Understand what your rights and obligations are. Don't sign anything you don't understand. Don't sign pre-contracts unless you understand what you're getting into. And understand how data and IP is treated. This is sort of a general principle. It's not really just restricted to contracting, but understanding what you need to know and where your IP and where your product essentially ends up. It's really important. And understand how to essentially get out of the arrangement. Understand what notice periods you have to do. Is it an automatic renewal? Is it a yearly contract? You don't want to be in a situation where you've had it with other party, you want to get out, oops, the contract renews for another 5 years and you're stuck. So again, I feel that I don't need to repeat myself. Get advice early, setup is cheap, failure is expensive. IP protection. This is a really broad topic that covers pretty much the secret sauce of your business. So I'll try and be a bit brief here to keep it focused on what you need to know. So the first thing is really important is to understand what IP do you have, how do you generate it. A lot of startups don't actually understand what they have. IP is just this vague term that they understand is important, but they don't actually understand how they're generating it. Understand how to protect your IP, and this could include registration or otherwise. I sort of work on an acronym, RRA, recognize, register, and assign. So you want to recognize what IP is registered, what IP you generate, register as much of it as you can, and assign everything back to the proper company or IP holding entity. Another key principle is you have to understand where your IP sits. You have to make sure your licensing agreements, assignment agreements, actually move IP to the correct entity, because if it all ends up in some entity that's not properly set up for it, or it's not properly assigned to the IP holding entity or the holding company, you might be at risk, and you have structuring risks to deal with down the road. Some common questions. There are 4 key types of IP. trademarks, patents, copyright, and trade secrets. Understand what it is you're generating, and that's half the battle when it comes to protecting it. Once you understand it, you can understand what steps you need to do to protect it. If it's a trademark, register it. If it's a patent, file it on it, and so on and so forth. And another question that you sort of have to consider is what happens if someone is using IP without your permission? Happens all the time, especially with early stage startups. The line between open source and proprietary is very, very vague, and it's blurred and it shifts all the time. I recommend getting advice on what open source tools or databases, etc., have you used to actually build your product. And how do you develop and commercialize it? This could be through licensing deals, white labeling agreements, and so on and so forth. This comes back a lot to how well your structure is set up to actually facilitate further commercialization. And some best practices. Understand what it is you're generating. That way you can protect it. Understand the difference between the types of IP you're generating. That way you can treat it properly. Assign, assign, assign. Every single man, woman, Uber driver, pet that you have that has had any involvement with your platform or product, make sure that their IP or the IP that they generated is properly assigned back to the company. Investors absolutely hate when they come in and it's unclear where IP sits, because it is a huge risk for them that they put in $1 million in your company because they like what you do. 2 years down the line, a former staff member, sues you for a share of it, or worst case scenario, they set up a competitor down the road, and all of it is for nothing. And again, make sure your IP structure is complete, your licenses are correct, it actually covers what you need to license, it covers what you need to assign, and it's all pointing in the right direction. And again, get advice early, setup is cheap, failure is, well, the end, really. You don't want to be stuck in court because IP disputes are expensive, courts don't like it, and judges are often really unclear on how to handle it. And for a startup, that just means tremendous fees and delays for you as you figure out how to get yourself out of the situation. Investment readiness. Investment readiness is more of a process than a one-off thing. It's almost a mentality that you put yourself into. You understand, this is what I'm doing. This is the current market I'm in. This is where I want to head to. And you prepare your whole company, your whole venture, your whole endeavor on how to get there. This is not something you can roll out of bed 1 month before your meeting with Airtree and decide, oh, I'm going to raise $1 million. You got to make sure your data room is set up correctly. You got to understand how much money you're asking for. How exactly you're going to get that money. Is it going to be upfront? Is it going to be in installments, essentially, or tranches? You got to understand what it is you're asking for, and is your business prepared to actually take it? Investors always do due diligence before signing a nice fat check to everyone. And as part of the due diligence, they want to know that the business is set up correctly. Are all of your contracts signed? Are all of your employees properly accounted for? Are they employees? Are they contractors? Are they working for other people? They want to know all this because they want to minimize your risk. And I guess at the end of the day, as a founder, your duty when it comes to getting investment ready is you want to give a potential investor as many reasons as possible to say yes, and as few reasons as possible to say no. And a lot of them pass on investments simply because it's too much work. They might like your idea. You might be the next Bing, Google Maps, whatever. But if it's going to take them 6 months to clean up your organization just to make it functional, they're going to pass. Give the money to someone else. And sorry, right before I go on, one of the things that I like the most about American corporate culture is their love for abbreviations, acronyms. And the holy grail for them is a 3-letter acronym, so I'm going to use one here. CLM, you want your structure to be clean, so no unnecessary sub-companies. You don't want to have 7 different types of shares. You want it to be lean, so you're going to hire the right amount of people for your organization, no more, no less. And you want to be mean. So when I say mean, I mean pragmatic. Investors are very picky about who sits on the cap table with them, who sits on the board with them. Is it someone that can add value to your organization? Is it a technical investor? Great, love to see it. If you're a co-founder, you got someone on that can cover an area that you're not so across, fantastic, love to hear it. Is it your mom because, she's your mom? Not so hot on it. Is it your friend because he buys you beers because he likes the story and, you want him on board because he's a great mate? No. That's a red flag. So figuring out who exactly is supposed to be there and who you want to bring on the journey is really important. Common FAQs, how much you ask for. There's this belief that more is better and you should ask for as much you can get. And while that's true to a certain extent, you don't want to ask for too much because you have to account for the money and how we're using it. It's fantastic if you're using the money to hire key staff. It's great if you're using the money for marketing, if let's say you're a consumer platform. It's great potentially if you're spending that money on, staff amenities, pool table, foosball, whatever. You want to keep your staff happy. That's fine. It's not so good if you spend $100,000 of Airtree's money on a nice vacation for yourself and your family. So you have to understand what you're asking for and be really clear with how you're going to use it. How do I prepare for a raise? That I sort of covered earlier. Essentially, it's a whole of company effort. You got to make sure that every part of your company is tip-top, it's squared away, you understand it. That's the most important thing. It's not about getting a fabulously complex structure. It's about understanding your structure, understanding where the weaknesses are, turning your mind to how exactly you can mitigate those weaknesses. Investors want to see that if, let's say, you don't have the money to actually go ahead and implement all of this, you have it ready as a plan. Like, they're happy to just see a strategy so you can say, look, I want to do X, Y, Z. I want to set up a holding company structure. I want to set up an ESOP. But look, right now, I want to put my money towards product development. As soon as you sign that check, the funds hit my bank account. I'm going to do all these things. That's fine. That's an acceptable answer. They want to see that you have a clear plan on what you're going to do with the money. What's the best structure? We sort of covered that earlier. Depending on where you are in your, I guess, your fundraising, if you're an angel, if you're at an angel stage, a single company structure, more than appropriate. Nobody wants to waste money in a complex structure. If you're a seed, if you're a Series A, and you're still running things out of one company, that's a problem. What's the best way to receive investments? I mean, look, there are various ways of doing it. You can take out a loan, you can refinance a house, you can give an investor equity in return for cash, you can do a safe note, con note, all sorts of things. Ultimately, it comes down to what's the best fit for you as an organization. Some key points. Again, understand your organization, because when you go through due diligence, you best believe that your investor will. And if he thinks you don't understand or you don't know what you're doing, that's usually a red flag and a termination of negotiations. Make sure your corporate structure is fit for purpose. It's not about being complex. It's about, does it actually work for your business depending on what stage you are? Make sure that you practice good corporate hygiene. So corporate hygiene essentially means that everyone in your company is accountable. You as a CEO and your board of directors, key executive team, whatever, have a clear system of accountability. This is sort of action through corporate governance. So whether it's on a monthly basis, weekly basis, quarterly basis, you sit down with your department heads, key staff members, you go through what are your staffing reports, staffing issues, what's your WIP platform look like for your product development, what's your sales platform look like, relationships, etc. Again, the forms aren't that important, it's about the substance. Show an investor that you've turned your mind towards thinking about this, and that's a tick in your favor. Also understand that it's a holistic process, it's a whole of business endeavor. It's not just something you as a co-founder and maybe one of your senior team members can do. Your entire business or startup needs to buy into this, because DD is difficult, it's forensic, it's painful, and you want everyone on board and understanding what's going on so they can actually get through it. Always keep in mind what your red lines are. Don't be afraid to walk away if it's a bad deal. Again, this just isn't limited to investment. This is just a general principle. And again, get advice early, get yourself set up. Setup is cheap, failure is expensive. And I guess I'm not going to repeat that. I feel that you've all heard enough from me on that stage. Understand your structure to minimize risk. Understand who your people are, protect them, and try and grow them as a culture and as a company. Treat them well, basically. Understand what your contracts say, understand what your agreements are, try to use them strategically. They're not just a means to an end, often they're a strategy all on its own. Protect and grow your IP, because that's your most important asset. And nurture your network and relationships. So essentially all of you are here or part of a Launchpad and its various programs because you understand that no man's an island. You don't have to do this alone. One of the things that I love most about the startup space is everyone's generally pulling in the same direction. Sure, you might have a peer in your space that's technically a competitor, but that doesn't mean you never talk to them. The connections that you can get are incredibly valuable. You don't know who can introduce you to a potential investor, potential CTO, co-founder, and the like. And that is about all I have for today. Thank you very much for taking your time. And